So I turned on the recording. So welcome everybody who is here yet, and also those who are not yet here, but will be joining at some point. As usual, I will be recording the sessions and make them available on Google Drive for the participants of the conference mainly. So you won't be showing up on Facebook or YouTube or whatever, or TikTok. It's only for the participants, so they can catch up on presentations they might have missed or they might want to hear again. If you don't want to be in the picture, you can turn off your camera. And if you don't mind being in the picture, you can leave it as it is. So this is the second conference we're doing on the same theme, Heidegger non-Western traditions of thinking. Some of the speakers were there last year, or yeah. So it's the second conference of what will probably be a series of. We'll see how far we go. Our first speaker is someone who's been here more often. It's I.S. Sampath. Um, he is an associate professor of philosophy of justice, rights, and social change at Brandeis University. He is mainly focusing on Hegel, Heidegger, and Derrida in his research. And they usually pop up in the things he presents. So I'll give it over to Roy S. To start things off, and looking forward to hearing you again.
Thank you, Alfred, and thank you again for your vision in leading us in organizing the conferences. I believe this is the second conference on Heidegger and non-Western traditions.
Yeah.
And I've been, as you probably are and others too, actively engaged in conversations with scholars throughout the world now, in the
Yeah.
global south and the east, who are busy translating and receiving and discussing precisely as we try to navigate, negotiate what's happening with Heidegger in the quote unquote Western European, North American, Anglo-American context.
Right.
Fraught with difficulty. So maybe later we can have a conversation about that. Very interested in what's happening with the Russian translations. I've been speaking to Eastern European Russian students about the latest translations they have, which are not recent, but what's happening there. So this is really a great opportunity for us to talk about the global kind of context for Heidegger. Let me share my screen. I don't have a full paper, unfortunately, nor do I have a PowerPoint, but I have an introduction to what I want to do. So it's just a few paragraphs once it comes up. Alfred, can you see that? Is it big enough for?
Yeah, you better make it a bit.
Okay, a little bigger.
Yeah.
Okay, I can make it bigger. Yeah. Now, better?
A little bit more.
Oh wow. Okay.
I have old eyes, so that's all right.
Yeah. Is this good for you?
Yeah. No.
Oh, you have old eyes. You don't have old eyes. Well, there's people much older. Um, so what I want to do here is if I can do that in 35, 40 minutes, then we have time for discussion, is just introduce one passage from Heidegger. Alfred knows one passage from Hegel.
Yeah.
And I've never really focused on this last paragraph in Absolute Knowing, the last chapter of the Phenomenology of Spirit. One line in one of the Gospels of the New Testament, Jesus on the cross. And then that's a lead up, as I've done for my previous conversation, on some passages in the Upanishads, which is part of the Vedic heritage of Hinduism and ancient Indian philosophy, but religious philosophy, particularly on their story of Genesis, as in which death is the central figure. So that's why the title of my talk is involving both time and death. In Heidegger's thought, that's the main title, but in relationship to these other traditions too. And my thesis, as you'll see, is that I believe, and I'm not asking anyone else to believe it, is that there's still, for me, after 35 years of engaging Heidegger, something so radically unique, incomparable, to use his words, non-relational, a radical individuation in his thinking for which we all are trying to understand its legacy and impact. Now, that doesn't mean it's superior or better or you know that we should all follow it. It's just an argument that I think there's something uncanny about this, what's happening in Heidegger compared to other traditions. Now, that doesn't mean to reduce the complexity of the other traditions. This is my interpretation. And I don't have the background in Sanskrit, for example, for Hindu philosophy. So I'm going to give you a translation with the Sanskrit, but English translation. I know a little bit of German. Alfred knows 10 languages, but a little bit of Greek and Hebrew and Latin, and French, but my main language is English. Okay, the singularity of the time-death relation in Heidegger's thought. This presentation will contrast differing time-death relations by examining closely a few passages from these four exemplary expressions in the Western and Eastern traditions. Division 2 of Heidegger's being in time, where I spend a lot of time. Absolute knowing in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, also where I spend a lot of time. And at least for the last 15 years, a lot of focus for me is on theology and the actual biblical text, the gospel account of Jesus' death on the cross and its meaning for New Testament Christianity. And then 4, death is Genesis. So unlike our Judeo-Christian idea of Genesis, literally the beginning and the creation, but the so-called beginning in the Upanishads is linked to death. Death is Genesis in this Eastern Indian tradition of the Upanishads, at least the major first Upanishad. Let us bracket for a moment any intuitive senses that arise when we think of death in time, time in death, time of death, the timing of death, death of time, endlessness, eschatology, and even time as death and vice versa. We want to think ontologically at the outset, not ontically in the spirit of Heidegger. One can say the relation, which are neither of successive nor simultaneous events, of time death, is irreducible to the history of human intuitions of either time or death and their historical and religious traditions. For example, resurrection, reincarnation, afterlife. So how we think about their relationship. I wish I had time for a departure, but I'm also busy with basic problems, Alfred, where, as you know, the last part, he goes back to Aristotle's physics. And, time and motion have a relationship with each other, but, you can't say time is motion and a moving thing. Heidegger's whole life, it's not what is time, but how do we even orient ourselves to the question of it as a horizon for understanding everything, being. So the time-death relation itself we can't take it for granted in any of these other traditions. So this paper will argue for the incomparable uniqueness of Heidegger's thought when contrasted with these 3 other civilization-shaping forms. Certainly Christianity for the West, and now, the global South and the East, at least since colonization. And let's say Hinduism is an Eastern tradition, but those are civilization-shaping. Hegel, for a lot of us in the Western and Eastern European context, shaped them, arguably foundational for the modern age. So maybe not a civilization, but an age. Heidegger's work is the only example to challenge commonplace notions of physical death and demise, and not a simple distinction in Heidegger, as our colleague, Professor Ian Thompson, has diagnosed. It's a very complex matter of being in time. But commonplace notions of physical death and demise, as well as religious notions of the afterlife, while boldly attempting to derive our common intuition of endless linear time with origins and ends, and being within time, Innerseitigkeit, from a more primordial, ecstatic, finite, authentic, unified, temporality. We will argue, even alone, that Heidegger's thought has nothing to do with the human body, life, mind, or soul. So for a lot of people in mainstream scholarship, at least Dasein has something to do with maybe not ontic existence, but as the existential in considering who we are as beings in relationship to the larger question of being. So even man this idea of man or ego or self or soul has to be decided, but at least, we're talking about us. And I'm saying, wait a minute, seeing that we have to deal with these other traditions too, when we talk about Heidegger, we won't start with these considerations. So you say, why are we even, we're not talking about human beings, what are we going to talk about? Rather, this finite, authentic temporalizing is likened to a complex event of equiprimordiality. That's in section 65, chapter 3, where he finally introduces ecstatic temporality in division 2. Gleichsprunglichkeit, if that for me is a very important question inside that section 65. And this defies interrelated registers of the three normal spatialized tenses of time, past, present, and future. This includes interrelated tenses of the three in various historiographical models of historical time, or various configurations of historical time in different epochs, namely circular, linear, and rectilinear. In chapter 5 of Division 2, Heidegger starts to deconstruct, destroy, diltai and different types of questions of historiography, historicism, historical time. He says this is also ontic, and you have to derive it from something deeper. So he too takes this on, but so many other after Heidegger philosophers of history have tried to look at the mystery of historical time. So we're not going to talk about that. The time-death relation in Heidegger's Being and Time to the enigma of motion, chapter 5, section 75. This is where he finally, kind of confesses that he confesses about many things in chapter 5. His whole analytic up until that point is incomplete. He hasn't gotten to Sein zum Geburt, being towards birth. He's talked about Sein zum Tod, being towards death. That's a very big one. But finally, this issue of Bewegung and Bewegtheit, the enigma of motion, in relationship to authentic fate as Geschichtlichkeit, historicality. So Geschehen, historizing in English, Geschichtlichkeit, historicality in English. Bewegung, Bewegtheit. This is all very uncertain in chapter 5, long before chapter 6, within timeless, datability, spanning, and then eventually Hegel. Heidegger's philosophy holds the unfulfilled promise of conceiving time as four-dimensional. So this is my thesis, and you can say, well, that's Heidegger's thesis too, in 1962. Bracket the fourfold in the later Heidegger, but I'm just saying here in Being and Time itself, and there's no missing division 3. There's this possibility that he couldn't conceive at that moment. Forget about the later Heidegger. We can talk about the early Heidegger, which I like and spend a lot of time with, but those of you that are interested in later Heidegger, we'll talk about that. But I'm saying right here in Being and Time. Unfulfilled promise of conceiving time as four-dimensional, grounded in an ontological ecstatic possibility of finite freedom, and this claim that cannot be fully established in those three other forms, namely Hegelian thought, mainstream, or Western Christian canons of the New Testament, and Hinduism. Can't talk about four, at least in Christianity. There's the Trinity, if you know about that religion. Don't talk about four. For the latter three, overcoming death and negation is the goal, albeit in radically different ways. It's hard to deny that the history of Western metaphysics leading up to Hegel concerns the human being in relation to transcendence. And all the world religions speak to the mystery of human finitude, life, and death. Why else would there be religion? Well, religion can exist for a lot of reasons, but for a lot of people, it's because they're afraid of death, as far as we know it as human beings. We mourn the death of others when we lose them. Where are they? Well, are they? But in contrast, Heidegger's early project is about the possibility of fundamental ontology, as you all know, reposing the question of the meaning of being a new introduction. So it can't be the speculative metaphysical grounding of logic as science, Hegel. And it also can't be the theological or philosophical registers of Western Christianity or Eastern Hinduism as world religions. So we are stating at the beginning for our project, let us state from the outset, we do not begin or end with the human subject in relation to any transcendental entity, be it being or God. If you want to say that's what Hegel's up to, okay. Certainly religions, there's no religion as far as I know. Bugs, maybe there is for some of the critical theorists in the choice. But most religions concern human beings and their fate and their mystery. Why were we created? Why do we die, etc. So this is the task to differentiate Heidegger's thought. Furthermore, the efforts here beyond extant, our efforts here beyond extant Heidegger scholarship, which makes any attribution of a new speculative metaphysical theory of four-dimensional time, or any general new metaphysics all to Heidegger's thought as whole, untenable. In other words, you're not supposed to be wildly coming up with your own metaphysical theory. You have to attend to the problems and the threshold, the Schwelle that Heidegger's thought represents with regard to the relationship to the history of metaphysics, what's been handed down to us, the desedimentation, destroying, freeing up possibilities, and then the attunement to what could be other to it as we await the possibility of another sense, but one that doesn't make the same kind of flattening, modern, nihilistic, technological, ego-driven, oppressive, structures that we live in, which is what he feels metaphysics culminated in. Many, many debates about this. But the point is that don't be foolish. Don't just go around making up a metaphysical idea out of Heidegger's thought. First of all, Heidegger won't listen to you, let alone the great communities that form around Heidegger, like Alfred's great work over the years with his colleagues. But we can say, well, obviously, literally what lies before and after Heidegger is irreducible to Heidegger. This may be Heidegger's limits, but let's see what we can explore. Okay. So let me introduce the passages here. And Alfred, this session goes till 9:45. What time should I end? You're on mute.
Out of politeness, I muted myself, but if you go to a quarter four, we'll be all right, 45 minutes.
So we can end at 10 o'clock? Or do you want to end at 9:45?
You can, if you end at 10 o'clock, then there's very little time left for questions or discussion. If you end a
No,
bit,
that's what I meant. The whole session can end it, but including
and
the question discussion.
yeah,
10 o'clock.
session ends at 10.
Okay, good. Okay. So let me end in about 20 minutes and then we can have enough time for discussion. Okay. So famous passage here, which I always come to, and it's not fair to just plop this massive passage into without looking at the whole section 74. As I mentioned in chapter 5, beginning with section 72, he announces that his analysis may be incomplete because he's looked at, being towards death. He, of course, is interested to introduce ecstatic temporality as the foundation of Zorga, care, concern, which constitutes the being of Dasein and Dasein's being in the world. So we know that's just the basic summary to that point. But now he's got to take on this issue of the stretchedness, the Streckung of life, which has two ends, being towards birth and being towards death. But he just, this is what he's going to try to open up, and he struggles with it. And by the time he gets to section 74, he's concerned with introducing the matter of heritage, fate. So the Geschichte and the Schicksal, but the name he uses is Geschichtlichkeit for authentic historicality. So the ontic ideas of being in history and historical time and historical memory and historical treasures and heritage, the subject and the historical present in relationship to the past, antiquities, all this is all ontic. There's something deeper which he has to get to in his project. But honestly, this authentic historicality will still itself be grounded even in this question of primordial temporality. So what is he saying about the primordial temporality? He sort of reintroduces the ecstatic temporality from section 65. Only an entity which in its being, so if I jump off the page here and go off for a little bit, Dasein's being, Zorga, care, so in its being, is essentially futural, anticipatory, but it's free. So for its death is possibility, section 49, chapter 1, division 1. Not impossibility, not negation, not ending, not perishing, not watching a bug hit the wall, stop. So not metaphysics of motion. Anticipation is possibility, greatest possibility, but the possibility of absolutely impossible, of no longer being in the world. Being lifted up in that transition and not being able to experience it. But that's the possibility. Non-relational, certain, indefinite. It can happen any time. It's not right now, clock time. Could happen right now, but My subjectivity is not tied to that linear time. Singular. I can't take the place of Alfred's. And, sorry, Alfred, you're not going to die soon. But at some point, I can't push you out of the way and the death comes for me. You have to go through it. The non-relation. So we remember all the prior sections there that free for this possibility can let itself be thrown back upon its factical there, the clearedness that allows the there to be there. The clearing, section 69, victim, again, is also made possible because of this ecstatic temporality. This is great. I wish I had the German in front of me. I do somewhere, but others can help me. We should look at the German. Shattering itself against death. That's the same entity which, as futural, is equiprimordial in the process of having been. He says this in 65. This coming towards is in the process of having been, and quite frankly, having been historizes out of the future. Both are the interrelational notion. And each of these ecstasies are relating to the other two differently. He says that several times, but he didn't clear that up. Maybe for some of you, he clears this up later in basic problems, or the Kant book, or Leibniz, 27 all the way up to 33 before he ends. He certainly doesn't do it in the last lecture in the Phenomenology of Spirit on Hegel, or the 1931 book on Aristotle's Metaphysics. And handing down to itself the possibility as an inherent, but freely chooses, I said that earlier, taking over its own thrownness and being in the famous moment of vision, Augenblick, for its time. So this is not within time, linear time, passing now points, no longer now, yet to be now, calendar clock time. Something massive here. But again, I warn us, I'm one of those really heterodox radical types. I don't start with the human being having a mystical vision, or the Christian mystics maybe, or any mystical tradition. The eternal now, that too is temporalized at a finite temporality. I know this is hard, folks, because you want to start with the human being or your own kind of humanity and figure out, okay, yeah, have we been there? All of our past failures and guilt and our aging process and our projects that remain unfulfilled. I want to stay in the depth of Heidegger's ontological structure. That's why I want to differentiate it from the other tradition. Only authentic temporality, which is at the same time finite, don't think of that as mathematically finite or spatially limited either. It's not spatial. Finite as in do you want to say it's like the bank account? I don't like that either. Only have a certain amount of insurance or money. I've used it up. Now I'm broke. I can't eat. I don't have any money. That's happening in our country, by the way. The government, they're destroying the government and people are losing their jobs. So it's not this type of finitude, but it's something more primordial that then derives or gives rise to that linear sense of form. That's the big project in Division 2. But all of this makes possible something like a fate and authentic historicality. Fate is not determinism. It's not the Greek gods up there playing with us, or the Hebrew prophets maybe, and the temporality of that. The fate of Jesus, as we'll get to, he was fated for something. But we have to leave those registers out. That's not part of the existential analytic. We have to get to the authentic historicality. Okay, I then want to contrast, I have about 10 more minutes. This, I know, I'm sorry, this is the long passage. It's the last paragraph of the last chapter of the Phenomenology of Spirit. And a lot of us may not be familiar with Hegel. So if this looks like some strange form, especially after what we got done talking about, I apologize. I'll try to show what I'm taking from this that's important so we can see Heidegger's contrast. And this is way before Heidegger tries to take on Hegel in section 82 at the very, very end of being in time. But let's go to, and it's interesting, he didn't quote this part. He quoted the previous sections in Absolute Knowing in section 82, but this is the very last. And it has this, first, the history of Hegel scholarship, It looks kind of similar to the Christian ending, but for the Hegel scholars, it's an Aufheben of that, because the chapter before absolute knowing, the philosophical shape, is revealed religion, which happens to be Christianity, which is superior to all the other religions for Hegel, and art and nature and these other shapes before them. So let's see this paragraph. Their goal is the revelation of the depth of spirit, and this is the absolute notion. Who's their goal? This revelation is therefore the raising up of its depth, or its extension, the negativity of this withdrawn I. I don't know what it has, it should be an I. A negativity which is its externalization or its substance, and this revelation is also the notion's time. Heidegger, moment of vision in its time, but equiprimordiality of the ecstasies, overcoming the fleeing of death, covering up of death, comparing myself to the death of others, historical memory of artifacts, the death of my relative, mourning the death of a friend. No, it's that radical individuation in its time. But here, what's going on here? We don't hear about within timeness. Externalization is its own self-externalized. You mean negativity, death, extension, demise, perishing. Well, we're not talking about the afterlife. He just got done submitting that to an Aufheben in Christianity. But he's taking something. This shape now has to take something from that other shape too. He's going to do something else. The goal, absolute knowing. Heidegger doesn't speak of a goal in his paragraph, but he does say it makes possible fate or authentic spirit that knows itself as spirit. Oh, of course. So in the science of logic, it gets even more complicated. It goes back to some Aristotle, but in the absolutely conceptually comprehending itself as absolute, which is the science of spirit, that gets more complicated. But here, absolute knowledge, finally, spirit knows itself as spirit, not these other shapes. As the path of recollection of spirits, maybe the heritage that Heidegger spoke about, handing things down, as they are in themselves, and they accomplish the organization of their realm. So all those other parts of those other shapes that were wholes, he of course shows the dialectical contradictions in them. That's why he has to take us through all those other previous shapes. They're important. But in all those moments that are facing all these contradictions, they have to be raised up into this whole structure that he thinks that his system is going to deliver. So their preservation, regarded from the side of their free existence, appearing in the form of contingency, is history. Freely contingent, not determined, perhaps finite, unexpected, Trump getting elected again. Maybe that was expected, but still for a lot of us, in shock. We don't know what's going to happen. When the next earthquake is going to be, or natural disaster, we don't know. So that's the contingent. But on the other side, it's a two-sided movement here, is the comprehension of the organization, the science of knowing, and the sphere of appearance. The two together, this is what he's trying to do, form the two together comprehended history, form alike the inwardizing and the cavalry of absolute spirit, the actuality, truth, and certainty of his throne, without which he would be lifeless and alone. That's very poetic for Hegel. But look how he ends it. That's literally the last sentence of Phenomenology, and then he quotes Schiller. Only from the chalice of this realm of spirits foams forth for him his own finitude. Marvelous. So comprehended history, what is that? Authentic historicality. That's not Heidegger is different. I said he's uniquely different. But let's try to cavalry, Golgotha, as you know, is the place of the crucifixion. The Hebrew for cavalry is Golgotha, place of the skulls. So, but he's not examining the Christian structure about the death of Jesus, the rememorialization, the Eucharistic presence, the eschatological awaiting of the second. He's done with that. He's trying to talk about something else. The problem is that nobody knows what he's talking about. So let's go to at least one passage of the many death scenes. So we saw Heidegger, we saw Hegel briefly, And now we're going to see this passage what does John take out of the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, for the ending scene, Jesus on the death. And if we try to Heideggerianize this, it's not just the death event on the cross, but his being towards death, being his death, being towards death as a way of being of Dasein. Not just waiting to die and physically die, but that's authentically what it is. And as long as it is, it's incomplete. The only thing that can complete it is death. But death is no longer being in the world, and you can't experience it. Aporia. Paradox. Many people struggle with this. The necessary incompletion of being in time because of that, and the end of metaphysics. But that's the release for us. That's the freedom that Heidegger gives us from both religion and metaphysics. Just accept that. But here's religion. When Jesus had taken the wine, he said, "It is finished." And bowing his head, he handed over the Spirit. This is John, and this is a footnote I use the New American Bible, which is the Catholic edition, and I like it because it gives you some interpretations about the Hebrew Old Testament of the Hebrew words, and then, of course, Greek and Latin. So in the footnote, handed over the Spirit, there's a double nuance of dying, giving up the last breath or spirit. Heidegger makes a lot of distinctions, remember, of perishing, demising, and death. And then for religion, passing on the Holy Spirit. So you don't get that in Heidegger. Hegel, which connects the giving of the Spirit with Jesus' glorious return to the Father, and where the author portrays the control of the Spirit. So for this Christian religion, there's a Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This is the death scene of that one person, Jesus, the historical person, the God-man. Holy Spirit is the third person, which will come after that, confers that. And of course, the whole structure still has a parousia, a second coming of this Jesus who died 2,000 years ago, to end the whole story and do something else, come up with a new creation. That's Christianity. And I'm sure a lot of you are not, I shouldn't say, but let's say many of you are not dogmatic believers of this kind of structure. But there's a lot happening here already in this completion part. I don't want to get into this problem of the aorist tense, but again, let's just double meaning of dying, giving up the last breath, but also passing it on. Giving of the Spirit linked to a return, so parousia problem, and then what many in the Christian faith believe is just this issue of the existence of the here and now. What does this all mean? How do we wait? Okay, I don't have time, but I can't take you through the Thessalonians, and even I wanted to show a resurrection story inside. One of the many problems of trying to think about resurrection as a concept in Judaism, in the Hebrew Bible, but the famous scene in Ezekiel, where God is telling the prophet, "Hey, go here, and you're going to see what power I have by these bones that you see. It's not just death. I'm going to make them come back alive." It's a very complex, fascinating story. But I have to get to the crux here, because this is where I paused, and I will conclude my presentation. I'm just telling you, as far as my understanding, I don't want to make any claims as a scholar about being able to compare the complexity of this tradition, this Hindu tradition, with what I just talked about, Heidegger, Hegel, and the Gospel account of the cross, the Gospel of John. I've spent my entire life in the West from the time I was a baby, and I was trained in the Western tradition. And later on in life, I decided to learn more about Western theology, Christian theology, and what Western Protestant, German Protestant, and quite frankly, German Catholic traditions. Because, quite frankly, Heidegger taught many of those great theologians of the 20th century, Paul Tillich, Karl Rahner, or influenced them in many ways, as you know. That's a different story. Bultmann's encounter early on. So the Heidegger story and the religious foundations are important, even though Heidegger departs from that. So I'm coming to this not as a scholar, but I have some familiarity because that's my ancestry is Hindu, my family in India. But so, reincarnation, definitely not resurrection, not Abrahamic, When I say non-white, was it just whatever we think within Western metaphysics, death, rebirth, no origin, no end, other to no origin, other to no end, other to origin. All these kind of dialectical or Derridian registers we can play with. I don't want to disrespect this tradition, but you can't, you have to bracket phenomenologically. Don't think of a body dying, a soul leaving and joining another life. That's like the mythic conceptions of reincarnation. Let's see what one of the famous passages, there's several for the Genesis story here at the beginning. This is from, and I'm not going to pronounce it right, I apologize, Brihad Aranyanka. It's the first and largest of the Upanishads, which is a philosophical crystallization of the much more older Vedic, what some people consider mythic foundations. But mythic, in a profoundly religious sense, is very important. But this is the philosophical crystallization. It comes, some people want to date it to the 8th century BCE. The first Hebrew Bible prophetic text may date that late 8th century, for example. The pre-Socratics are the 6th and 5th century. Buddha may be there. Zoroastrianism, Confucius, different traditions. Plato, Aristotle later. And then, of course, the New Testament is canonized much later, 3 centuries after Jesus' era, but 0 to 100 is the period of the life. So this is very old. I won't read the Sanskrit, but there is nothing whatsoever here in the beginning. Those of you may be more familiar, think about Genesis. I don't know. In the beginning, God created heaven and the earth. The earth was void, but then time and day and light and day, all the sequences of creation come. But here, nothing whatsoever in the beginning. Only it was covered by death. The Hiranyagarbha, hunger. Hunger is death. He, whatever the he is, created the mind thinking. Let me have a mind. Some parallels are this kind of panentheistic I. How could the origin of the I, which Heidegger is concerned about, so is Kant, so is every great Western philosopher. But what is this I and Cartesian I? But when the second you say I am, you're kind of saying I'm alone, which is kind of funny. Like you say I am. Oh, I'm individuated completely. Oh, I'm not connected to anything. I'm alone. But he says, let me create, I'm alone. But he moved about worshiping himself since movement. He was worshiping water was produced since his thought. I was worshiping water sprang up. Arca, fire is so called. Water or happiness surely comes to one who knows how fire came to have this name of Arca. I'll bracket that second part because, similarly to pre-Socratics, you may find many different type of pre-Socratics in the Greek tradition where each of these elements have importance. But I want to stay at that very beginning part, which is to really get at the ecstatic temporalization and the epiprimordiality of rebirth. You want to bracket the ontic consideration of, let's say me, I was born at a certain time, but I'm the rebirth of some other person that died. And I may have some recollection or memories of that past life. It's a karmic cycle of sin. If I did better in that past life, this life will be easier. The whole point is to break this cycle of the soul moving through bodies, get to a supersensory state beyond the body of pure enlightenment. So it's a different type of trajectory, but it's, if you want to do an ontological version of that, like a Heideggerian version of that, you don't want to just use those types of registers. You want to get into in fairness to the tradition, their own metaphysical depths, which is precisely what Heidegger's doing for his, when he goes back to Plato and Aristotle, quite frankly, Hegel, and the knowledge he would have and be most familiar with is, of course, his Christianity, both Protestant and Catholic, for his time. So in conclusion, what am I trying to do here? I'll go back to the very beginning. Let's see here, and just give us one more reading of, or at least one more glimpse of the Heideggerian problem. What I want to argue is that what could be helpful as we imagine what's happening in Division 2 of being in time when we imagine the possibility of the missing division 3 on time and being as part of part 1, because at the end of the introduction of being in time, the introduction to being in time, the outline of what the whole system is going to look like is part 1, which is all we get, with its 2 divisions, but a third division that didn't appear. And then part 2, he'll talk about Kant, Descartes, Aristotle. And he tries his best right after that, after being in time. Basic problems, he tells us there are hints about the time problem in Kant and Leibniz. Of course, the Kant book. Bergson, he'll say, hey, is also questioning linear time. He's a very important guy, but he and relativity, quite frankly, Einstein questioned simultaneity of events, succession events, but that's all ontic spatialized stuff, so they don't get it. So who cares, first of all, but 2, it's Aristotle that we got to go back to. And we'll stop playing here to say that the chance to articulate out of being in time and the missing division 2, for me, with the specific, as he says, laborious reconsideration of Aristotle. If you remember in section 81, he gives us the great quote from Plato, time is the moving image of eternity. He goes back to the fact that Aristotle lays down the foundations, not in a simple way. He's being very fair to Aristotle. People think he's just reducing himself, but he says the counting idea, time is the counting measure of motion, but the relationship between time and motion, time has something to do with motion. It's beside it, it's around it, but it's not motion itself that's ontic. That's being in time. It's really amazing that it can somehow reincarnate, in a way, the great project that began in the West. That's pre-Christian. But I also find these eerie similarities that we have between what Heidegger is doing with certainly the Christian text about the being towards death of Jesus on the cross. But via Hegel, the output shouldn't be the afterlife or dogmatic Christianity. We Western metaphysicians who care about this continental tradition from the Greeks all the way up to Hegel, which is what Heidegger cared about, and the Western Christian tradition, in a way, is anti-Christian, because what's more interesting is the being towards death up until that moment on the cross, not what the story tells us about what happens afterwards. He's resurrected, et cetera, et cetera. And I certainly don't want to reduce this complexity of reincarnation, as I said. But here we're talking about, with the Hindu tradition, something that has absolutely nothing to do with that gospel story. So Heidegger, to me, and the later Heidegger, if you will, about the other possibility, the other sense, the other beginning, the transition passage to the other beginning, that holds the promise. As we respectfully understand these other traditions, but realize that to put our own human being into question as a Dasein means that this may sound terrible, it's like Schopenhauerian, resist that desire of the will that will take us back to these religious registers and or something that gives us the final answer, which is maybe the Hegelian intent, that we live in the suspension. And therefore, 9:48, I will suspend my ending and give us a superficial ending here so we can have a conversation. So thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Vai, for your presentation. As usual, if somebody has a question, please feel free to speak out or raise the little yellow hand that's somewhere. Or, normally I can't find it, but any questions, anyone? No. Yes, Olivia has a question.
Yes, I just want to clarify something. When you spoke about the four-dimensionality of time, that you interestingly showed that was already at play in Sein und Sein. Did you said that like you used the metaphor of some kind of a depth, a depth, like a financial debt, like you have a
Oh,
fixed amount of money in there. But I was just wondering, I heard you say like, oh, you don't need to okay, it's not like we have finite time. It's not a matter of space also. The finite aspect is not, is it what you said?
well, it's not me. It's mostly when Heidegger wants to get away from metaphysics, he
Yeah.
uses that debt accounting, using itself up, consuming itself. I have nothing settled to
Oh yeah,
account
yeah.
anymore into the death chapter, but also section 65, right after section 66, after 65. Again, he brings up this question of like the mysteries, even that you find in Aristotle's physics. Like I've
Yeah.
used up my time. I don't have enough time. What do we mean by all these? And then
Yeah, yeah.
Heidegger later on, he'll do that in the boredom book. Fascinated by the registers. And he doesn't mean linguistically, like how do we use time in different languages to
Yeah.
express these tenses. He's just saying, what the heck are we talking about when we talk about time?
Yeah.
And so, what I mean is, and all of you may be familiar also with, you may say, Raj, you're cheating because you're just denying the later Heidegger. No, no, I know what's going on in the fourfold, the mirror play. This is going to be a reductive answer, but from the Beitrager all the way up to Time and Being, because in Time and Being he does say true time, 1962. He tries to go back again. This time, time and being, not being in time, is the Bezug and the Bozug relationality is it's true time is four dimensional. And in Basic Problems 27, he says dimension, I don't mean I mean horizon. I don't mean spatial limits and extension.
Hmm.
So we can't use finite mathematically or metaphysically or spatially. On the other hand, the Western tradition has given us only things like origin and end and no origin and no end. And this is what Aristotle and Plato give us, start the whole project of metaphysics with, Zeno. And they have a problem with origin and end or no origin, no end, and the metaphysics of motion. And then
No.
Aristotle introduces the time component. Heidegger says, okay, thank you. And there's nothing I can do, and maybe for you too. This is what's given to you. But this also destroys a possibility of another beginning. If this is all we're going to come at the question, if we're going to come at the question this way, we're stuck. We're stuck in these limits, what Derrida might call the closure. Um, and I'm saying no. It's just I love the late Heidegger's potentiality for that creativity, but I want to, unlike many people, I want to see it in the boring scholastic, logical structure of the possibility of fundamental ontology, which means just going back into being done, of course, all the early Heidegger. And in the four dimensional ways would be the missing division three. So in other words, it's not, if you really want to get into it, past, present, future, future, past, present, you can iterate those 6 times, just if you just do that in
Hmm.
your own head. So we're not talking about 6 sets of three here, but then if you invert that, you can have 3 sets of 6 interrelations. And I know this gets into some dark numerology for those of you who know the Christian tradition. And but it's or for Hegel too, if you want to say the equiprimordiality and the schemas of the ecstatic temporalities relate to
Hmm.
each other differently. I'm my having beenness, the coming towards, making present. Each of these axes relates to the other two differently. So you have 3 triangles, and maybe the interrelation would be a fourth that moves around. That's all ontic too. You don't want to spatialize any of this because that's just crazy, and Heidegger would admit that. But the non-Western structure is more archaic, and it's the other for you and me too, even though I'm supposed to descend from
Hmm.
this tradition, the Eastern traditions. So the fact that the facticity of that and my encounter with that, maybe Lebanesian way, ethics in my relationship to it, I don't want to take that structure because I don't want to disrespect it. I want to argue that inside Heidegger is an unfinished possibility of totally breaking from Western metaphysics. And he
Hmm.
says Nietzsche failed. Nietzsche tried with the eternal return, but there it is. And he was rushed, Alfred, to get being in time in. Jaspers looked at the missing division three and said, "This is nonsense." And the archival debates in history about it. Like, was it destroyed? What did Fritz do with the? Did somebody keep the script? And I wish Alfred can tell us more, but it doesn't exist. And my ambition over here is just to continue the project of being in time, as if,
Hmm.
let's say, Heidegger was continuing with the missing division three. Now, the
Hmm.
repercussions for us in the Western Dasein is, uh-oh, this is scary because we have to deal with Hegel and Christianity and the Greeks again. But Christians are not going to like it.
Hmm.
So
Okay. Hmm.
Maybe it didn't answer the question of the
Interesting.
debt.
Oh, no,
Thank
no,
you.
but I think it's thought provoking, I guess. It's just, it's, yeah, it's
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
Just, yeah. It's in the
Thank you. I
morning in
look.
North America. I'm still having
Yeah.
my coffee, and I'm like, oh, that's like
Well,
a
let's
triple shot
let's
of
you and I can
espresso.
maybe you and I can talk later about your
Yeah, for
work
sure.
and how this might connect. Yes, yes, Alfred. Can you give us some enlightenment on the archival story, or if you want to,
Well,
what happened with the publication of Being in Time and the book?
simple, to put it very simple, Heidegger needed to publish a book if he wanted to be the successor of Nikolai Hartmann as the full professor at the University of Marburg, Ordinarius. And that's why he went to Totenberg in March 26 and worked there for a couple of months on Being in Time and wrote the
He
first.
did, in the first time in his life, he never shaved.
Yeah, he wrote 178 pages. And you can see in Being in Time that he's using elements from different kinds of investigations he did before Being in Time. So it
Yeah,
all was
history of the
part of,
concept of time.
yeah, the review of the Delta York correspondence is ad
Hmm.
verbatim. Part of it is in Being in Time, so all this part of Being in Time in that sense.
Yeah.
And as he was still writing Being in Time and finishing the second division, he was already getting the proofs of the first division.
Uh, which happens a lot of.
Uh, when at the end of 26, he or the beginning of 27, he went to Jaspers again for 10 days in Heidelberg and brought his
Hmm.
the third division with him and discussed it with Jaspers. And in this discussion, he came to the conclusion that the way he had worked it out was not sufficient. And
Yeah.
told the publisher, Niemeyer, that they should print the first two divisions and that he would come up with the third division at a later point. And of course, it was already a big book being published together with Mathematische Existenz by Oscar Becker uh, as one volume of the Husserl's.
Poor Oscar Becker. He gets forgotten by history.
And so it was then published as the two sections, the two divisions. At that point, Heidegger was still convinced that he would be able to write a new version of Division 3 within the coming months or before the end of 1927.
Yeah. And he gets the phenomenological critique of the Critique of Pure Reason and the 29 book and Leibniz, ecstatic temporality. But if you know the basic problems, which is what a lot of people feel,
Yeah.
okay. But temporality versus Zeitlichkeit and then the ontological science of all being is rooted in this. He keeps coming back to it. And then, as you know, a lot of people want to say, well, wait a minute, all this stuff ended, it collapses, and he tries again with the Beiträge, but doesn't publish it until much later after it was written. But
It's,
that was the second attempt, and then the late Heidegger debates began. And I don't do that. It's just unfortunate that we can't get a glimpse of what the architectonic of what the missing Division 3 is. But my hypothesis is that there would have been the last question of Division 2 is time does time itself reveals itself as a horizon being, not the understanding of being, but time. We got to go from being Dasein to the question of being, but then go from time to being itself. Being becomes a central figure, then eventually Agnes. And Alfred knows that I've been struggling with articulating this. I mean, I have my views, but my pillars are really Western metaphysics, Hegel, and the last 15 years, the religious traditions of the West. But I say we have to be, let's not forget the archaic nature of the non-West as irreducible to that, and therefore the possibility, another possibility that we better take seriously.
yeah. Okay. Well, we're almost at the end of your time,
Yeah,
so
I think that's good.
thank you
Okay,
again,
thank you, Alfred.
and see you again. And take care in the meantime. Bye bye.